Maseches Bava Kamma Dafayin Vav discusses the last case in our most recent Mishnah, where he discussed what happens if somebody steals an animal, then he's makdish it, and then he shechts it or sells it. So the Mishnah said that everyone agrees that he's chayev kefil for the stealing, of course, but there's a machlokes as to whether or not he's chayev the dalad v'hei for the tvicha mechira. According to the Tana Kamma, he's potter because at the time that the tvicha mechira happened, it belonged to hektish. And according to Rabbi Shimon, he's chayiv for it if it was a carbon that he's responsible to replace. That is his responsibility. Now, there are two types of carbonis, nidarm and nidava. If it is a neder, that means that he promised to bring a carbon, let's say an ayla, and then even if he set aside a certain animal to be that carbon, if the animal gets destroyed or somehow is no longer able to serve as the carbon, he has to replace it. That means that it's his responsibility to make sure that he comes up with an ayla. That's him being chayev b'achrayusan. According to Rabbi Shimon, that would be his responsibility, and it's still considered to be his property. And the reason is because since he has to replace it, it's worth money to him. Although it belongs to hektish, it's worth money to him. If it's worth money to him, then it's considered to be his property to some extent. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon is saying, in that situation, it would be considered his, and if it's his, then there is a tvicha mechira, and he would be chayev the dalad vei for that. So the Gemara first discusses the opinion of the Tana Kamma. So the Gemara wants to know, I understand that he's not chayev for the shechita because the shechita happened to the carbon, which was hektish, and not in his rishus anymore. However, the mechira he should be chayev for, not for the mechira itself where he sold something which belongs to hektish, but when he transferred it to hektish property, when he was makdish it, that's like a mechira. What's the difference if you transfer to the property of another head eater or if you transfer to the property of hektish? Either way, you stole something and then transferred it to the property of something, so some other entity. So the hektish, where your makdish it itself, should be like mechira, and it should chayev him the dalad v'hei for that. So Gemara tries two answers. First, Gemara wants to say that it's Reb Shimon, and it's talking about where you're chayev b'achayusa, you have to replace it, and therefore it's worth money to him when it's his property. And it's not considered to be hektish. It's not a transferring to hektish. So the Gemara says that can't be because Reb Shimon clearly argues on this case. He's the next opinion, so this Tana Kamma is obviously not Reb Shimon. So second attempt, the Gemara wants to say that it's Rabbi Yosi, and we're talking about where it's kachim kalim. Rabbi Yosi holds a kachim kalim, which are a lighter form of karbonis that can be eaten by the bailim, for example, like a shlamim or some asham. Then kachim kalim, according to Rabbi Yosi, haglili is still the property of the owner, of the makdish. It doesn't become the property of hektish. So the Gemara wants to say maybe that's what we're referring to. So Gemara rejects this because if that's true, then when the Mishnah was looking for a contrast, and was looking for a case that you are chayiv, even despite hektish, so which it brought in the previous Mishnah, so it didn't have to say what we said in the previous Mishnah, where if the hektish happened after the tvicha mechira, that's where you chayiv. It could have said where you makdish it before tvicha mechira, but you makdish it for kachim and not kachim kalam. You makdish it as a chatas or as an ayla, which is out of the shus of the bailam. That would have been the better contrast and the closer contrast. We didn't say that. Obviously, it's not true, and therefore that's not the pshat here. So Gemara therefore settles on its final answer, which is that it's not Rabbi Yosi, it's kachim, but being makdish something is never considered to be like a mechira. You're not chayiv the dalad v'hei for being makdish, because it's still considered to be, it has your name on it, even though it's hektish's property, but when people talk about it, they'll call it Ruvain's carbon oila. So a normal sale is where Reuven sells something to Shimon, and people used to call it Reuven's, and now it's called Shimon's, so it's not known as his property any longer. Here, it used to be called Shimon's, and now it's called Shimon's Oila, or it used to be called Reuven's, and now it's called Reuven's Oila. So it's still his property, and therefore it doesn't count as a Tvich Mechira, not Mechayev the Dal Vehei. The Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah and moves on to discuss Reb Shimon's opinion, and the Gemara has a few questions on Reb Shimon. So Reb Shimon says that he's chayiv the dalad v'hei for tficha mechira if it was a carbon that he has to replace it. He's chayiv and it's achrayis, that it was a neder and he's chayiv to replace it. So the Gemara assumes at first that he's not mechayiv for the shchita, because even a carbon that you have to replace doesn't belong to you, it belongs to hektish. And therefore, if he was makdish and then he did a shchita, it doesn't matter what kind of hektish it was, can't be chayiv for that. So Gemara assumes that he's being mechayiv you for being makdish. That means he holds that by being makdish it's like an actual mechira, not like what we said before in the Tana Kamma. That's the point that he's arguing on. Makdish is a mechira, and therefore is mechayev you for that. So the first question is, why? Then it's the opposite. Why should it be mechayev you for a situation where you have a chayis for it, and he patters you where you don't have a chayis for it? Fakert, in the situation where you have a chayis for it, it's more yours, and it's less being transferred to hektish rishus. So it should be patter for that case. It's not a real mechira. While a situation where you transfer to hektish rishus is more of a real hektish, and you don't have a chayis on it, and that should be where you're really mechayev. So the Gemara says, Rav Shimon wasn't talking about this case. Rav Shimon was talking about something else. He was referring to a situation in which somebody steals something that the original owner was makdish. So let's say Ruvain has an animal, he's makdish it. And Shimon comes along and he steals that. So is that considered to be a theft that he can be chayav gnev aveda for? So the Gemara there brings the simple understanding, which would be that no, it's not, because the Torah says v'gunav mi beis ha'ish v'na mi beis hektish. This doesn't belong to the Ruvain; it belongs to hektish. So now Reb Shimon says no. If Ruvain was makdish it and a situation where he's chayav b'achriyusa and he has to replace it, that is, if he made a neder, so then it's worth money to Ruvain, because when it's stolen from him, he has to pay for a whole other animal. Therefore, it's something which causes value. It's something which causes, it's what we call a davar hagoyrim l'mamayin, and Rav Shimon holds that it's still considered to be his to some extent. It counts as megud mi beis ha'ish because he ends up having to pay more, and therefore he could be chayiv dalad v'hei if he goes ahead and he sells or shechts that. The Gemara's next question is, how could Rav Shimon be chayiv dalad v'hei for shchita of kachim? Rav Shimon holds that a shchita she'ina ruya, shchita which is not a kosher or valid shchita, is not mechayev the dal v'hei. Since this is kachim, it's shchita sheina ruya. You're not shechting it properly if it's not inside the base magdish being brought as a carbon. So the Gemara gives three answers. The Gemara's first answer is from Rav Dimi, named Rav Yechanan. He says it was shechted as a carbon properly. It was brought as a carbon tamim in the base of Mikdash for the bailam, and therefore it's 100% fine. So Gemara asks on that then it belongs to the owner. The Karen has gone back to the bailam because it was shechted for him, and he could use it. So Gemara answers the blood spilled, and therefore he can't be makar of the blood on the mizbeach. The shchita is a shchita ruya, but the carbon ends up not working for the bailam. It's not mechaper without the blood being put on the mizbeach, and therefore he has to bring another one. So he didn't get the Karen back; he still has to get paid for the Karen. Whereas second answer is Rava named Rav Yechanan, who says that it was shaychet the tmimim. It was brought as a carbon, but not l'shem the bailam. It's a shchita ruya; it's a kosher carbon, but it doesn't work for the owner. Rish Lakish says, arguing on these two versions of Rav Yechanan, he says no, it was a balmum and it was b'chutz, and therefore it's called shchita ruya because a balmum is no isser of shchita chutz, and therefore it's a kosher shchita. Now the Gemara says Rabbi Elazar had a kasha both on Rabbi Yechanan, at least Ravin's version, and on Rish Lakish. The word the Gemara uses is that he sniffed at it. So on Rabbi Yechanan, the kasha is in the answer that the shchita is a shchita ruya, but the blood got spilled. He says, but the blood is what's matir it, and therefore it's not a shchita ruya. Without the blood being brought on the mizbeach, the shchita itself is a psul. According to Rish Lakish, you have to redeem it before it becomes mutter to shecht b'chutz. It's not the mum that's matir to shecht b'chutz; it's the redemption. So the Gemara answers that he missed a halacha that Reb Shimon said, "Kol ha'imid lizrik kizarak dami." If the blood is ready to be spilled, if the blood is ready to be put on the mizbeach, it's like if it was, even if it got spilled. And if the animal is balmum, it's ready to be redeemed, it's like it was redeemed, even if the redemption didn't happen yet. And therefore, both of those already happened. It's considered like the redemption happened, and it's considered like the matir of the blood on the mizbeach happened. Now, what are the sources for these halachas? So the Gemara first proves that kol ha'imid lizrik kizarak dami. Rashi points out this is only if it had a mum before you were makdish it. If you got a mum after you makdish it, you do have to do the pidyon. But the source for this halacha, so the Gemara quotes a brisa of Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon is talking about the halacha of noiser. So something which is noiser is tamei, tumas oichlin, where Rabbi Shimon draws a distinction between noiser, which could have been eaten, it had a time in which it was kosher at some point, and noiser, which was never kosher at any point, can never have been eaten. The reason for that distinction is he has a drasha where it says oichel asher yeyochel has to be something which you could have eaten at some point. So if there was a moment at which this noiser, which this carbon, which is left over too long, if there was a point in which it could have been eaten, at that moment it got the din of oichel, and then when it becomes nicer, it's tamei. It's already royed to be mekabel tuma, and it becomes nicer. It's tamei. The status of royed mekabel tuma comes, that never leaves. Now, if, however, it never had any point at which it was royed lachila, the carbon wasn't finished before it became nicer, and it's never considered eichlin, it never has the status of tumas eichlin, and can never be makabel tumas nicer, and it's not eichlin at all. Now, what's the situation? What are these two cases? So, Rabbi Shimon says in the Brisa, if it became nicer, and he specifically refers to a carbon that becomes nicer overnight, that is, it has to be finished before sunrise. So if it became nicer, if the night ended before it ever had Zrikas Adam, so it was never mutter to eat, because you can never eat it until after Zrikas Adam. Zrikas Adam never happened. It became nicer, so it went straight from Isser, that the Zrikas Adam, the matter of Zrikas Adam never happened, to the status of it nicer. It was never Eichel, never Eichlin, therefore it's not Makabel Tumas Eichlin. If, however, it was after Zrikas Adam, and then it became nicer later, so in the period between the Zrikas Adam and the sunrise, when it becomes nicer, it was Eichlin. So it's a Makabel Tumas Eichlin. When it becomes nicer, it's Tamei Tumas Eichlin. That we have an adjustment. The Gemara says that we learned, and we said before, that you don't need real Zrikas Adam. You need Roy for Zrikas Adam. Now, Zrikas Adam has to be done during the daytime before Shkia. So, a case of what we call Zrikas Adam is where the carbons, all the Avodas up to Zrikas Adam was completed before Shkia, and you had time to do Zrikas Adam. Then it's Kol Ha'imid Lizar Kizar Dami, it's considered like Zrikas Adam happened, and that's Karva Matir, and now it's mutter to eat, and the rest of the halacha, which Reb Shimon says, is Mechabel Tumas Eichlin. What do we mean when we say that it never had Zrikas Adam? We mean there was never Roy. That the Shechita happened very close to Shkia, and there was never a moment at which you could have brought the Dam on the Mizbeach during the day. It was not Roy. And therefore, had it been Roy, it would have been considered like it was a Zarek and you would have a Matir. Since it was never Roy, it was never, it's never Kizarek and there's no Matir. So you see from there, Kolaim Lizarek Kizarek Dami, if it's ready to be Zarek, it's considered to be a Matir, and the Shechita is kosher, not a Shechita she'ena Ruya. Now, what is the source of the halacha that Kol ha'oimed liftais kipadi dami? So the Gemara brings again from Rabbi Shimon, who talks about a paraduma that it is mekabel tumas eichlin because there is a moment in which it can be redeemed. When can it be redeemed? So Rish Lakish explains, Rabbi Shimon is referring to that any time the para is on the maracha before it's actually burned, it could still be redeemed. And the reason is because if you find a paraduma which is better than this one, you want to replace it, you could still cancel this one, redeem it, and bring the other paraduma in place of it. Now, over there, Reb Shimon is saying that it's Makabel Tumas Eichlin even if you haven't redeemed it, just because it's right to be redeemed. Every paraduma is Makabel Tumas Eichlin. So you see, Kol ha'omed liftais kipadui dami, and has this halacha.